attitudes towards God. What is my basic attitude towards God? What do you think of God? Do you like God? Are you afraid of God? Do you come to church and pray because you have to, or you're scared not to? So we live out of our attitudes and belief systems. Our emotions proceed from our basic attitudes. Hence, we need to look first into what attitudes we've brought with us from early childhood that is affecting our behavior and perhaps secretly influencing the way that we relate to this marvelous reality that has brought us into existence and wants to bring us into the maximum amount of divine love and light and life than we can possibly receive. Part of our human condition is that we come into the world without any experience of the divine. And we gradually develop psychologically without an experience of God. And it's God and our conscious awareness of God that is human health. This is not a statement of mine, but comes from St. John of the Cross. Human health, true human health, he says, is the conscious experience of God. But not having that conscious experience, we have to develop attitudes towards God at each level of our human development through childhood. And sometimes the first attitude we have towards God is that of protector. And then a little later we hear about God in catechism, and we think of him perhaps as transcendent, as the supreme authority whom we have to obey. And then again we may experience God as the rewarder of good and the punisher of evil. And a little later we think of God as justice, who is always helping us to understand the difference between right and wrong. All of these attitudes are normal and to be expected in our human development. But sometimes they're exaggerated and lead to distorted feelings about God, or emotionally charged feelings about God that are not only inadequate, but positively harmful. To get rid of false ideas of God or inadequate ideas of God would be doing God and yourself a great favor. Some of our childish ideas should be put in the wastebasket. They're an insult to the living God and the Abba whom Jesus has revealed and seeks to communicate to us. This is really the heart of the Christian religion. It is the reception and the transmission through the Christian community of the experience of God as Abba, that is, as Father, and not just as any father, but as a loving Father. This was a revolutionary idea at the time of Jesus, because the concept of God was of the God of armies. The popular concept was the transcendent God who could only be worshipped in the temple. And many of Jesus' parables speak of moving the place of the sacred from the temple or to sacred times and places to everyday life, where God is totally available at every moment in virtue of the divine indwelling. But right now I want to look at some really bad ideas or attitudes towards God that are more insulting than anything else. And perhaps this Lent you could, with the help of grace, lay them aside once and for all in your spiritual journey. They're the result of an inadequate idea of God that is pretty endemic for children growing up or receiving a Christian education that is too rigid or strict from parents who themselves have not outgrown their attitudes, and sometimes even from teachers who should know better. One pet idea or attitude that children often have is to think of God as a policeman who is always on the watch, not benignly to rescue you from bullies, but watching for your least fault so that he could punish you or make you stay after school or whatever punishments are meted out in a particular milieu. Or again, he's sometimes experienced as a tyrant demanding instant obedience or else. And the commandments as they're presented are sometimes presented outside the context of the Abba that Jesus revealed. And finally, there is the worst one of all, the concept of God with an emotional charge to it as judge, always ready to bring down the verdict of guilty. This is a good start on a serious neurosis. In any case, God is not like any of those concepts. They belong to a misguided childhood, and one of the greatest things you can do for yourself is to spit on them. I put it rather strongly because they have deep roots in our emotional system, and emotionally charged thoughts sometimes sit in the unconscious, where they secretly influence our actions and attitudes. Let me give you an example to bring this home. Perhaps some of you have heard about the late Cardinal Hume. He came from a very strict English Catholic background. So his dear mother was a real strictie in the sense that she felt she should discipline the children, prepare them for life. Well, that's okay as long as people take responsibility for their own sanctions and don't blame them on God, which is a favorite practice of some parents. In any case, she brought her children together one day and said to them, "Children, you see that cookie jar there in the pantry? That's only for those feast days that we celebrate in a special way. And I don't want any of you to put your hand in that jar in between meals or at any other time." And her sanction was, because God is always watching you. Notice the resonances of policemen there, okay? Now this young man, in his youth, Basil Hume, was a sensitive child who was developing a great trust in God. And so, sure enough, he didn't put his hand in the jar. I don't know about the other children. His idea of God now changed. This is a story he told on himself to the American bishops during a retreat that he gave. And so this little boy then is now thinking about God not as a trusting, loving father that he had started out with, but as this hazardous personage that could punish him for the slightest fault, such as eating a cookie in between meals. So here he was thinking of God like this. Years pass. without her intention, this good woman retarded his spiritual life for maybe 10 or 20 years. Well, he said at the end of this story that he shared with the American bishops, you know, one day, one time, I had a mystical experience of God. That is to say, if you prefer, a contemplative, I use those terms interchangeably, a contemplative experience of God. In other words, a real sense of God's presence. And from that moment on, I realized that if as a youngster I had put my hand in that cookie jar, and if God was really watching, like a policeman, he would have said, why don't you take another one? Now this, I submit, is the God of the Christians. I don't know this other God, and I don't want to. But we all have met this other God in one degree or another. And in my generation and in several generations following, this teaching was common doctrine. And it emphasized the fear of God. Now, in Scripture, we hear about the fear of God, but it's a technical term. It doesn't mean the emotional fear of God. But fear really means, most of the time in the Old Testament, a sense of reverence or a sense of personal integrity in the face of God as truth, which is a positive attitude, not a negative one towards God. And so, with each stage in human development, from early childhood into early adulthood, we pass through new ideas and attitudes of God, such as I just mentioned. God is protector, and that can be distorted by thinking God as policeman. Or the God of justice can make us think that someone has appointed us to judge other people if they misbehave. Nobody has, by the way. And so there is this idea of God as the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the evil that could initiate ideas of doing things not out of the love of God or out of trust of God, but out of a desire to placate God and to guarantee our future successful passage to heaven, or at least to purgatory. But this is not love. What is missing occurs in contemplative prayer, and that is that God is the God of infinite mercy. If you don't have that as a conviction, it's the chief order of your spiritual journey. You don't know God until you know that. The whole teaching of the parables emphasizes that God runs this world not on the basis of justice alone, but mostly through mercy. You only have to think of the parable of the workers in the marketplace. Remember, those that worked all day long in the heat of the day and sweated it out received the same amount of reward or salary, whatever you call it, as the guys that were invited at the 11th hour. So the parable is set up to make the hearers sympathize with those who worked so hard and didn't get more pay by paying those who came latest first. So what are you going to do with the God who says, when they complain, can't I do what I like? What God likes is to show mercy. And so you can't count on the reward of your efforts, or you can compare yourself to others, because God gives this wonderful life to everybody who asks for it. In a sense, there are no chosen souls, because everybody is chosen. and God as the Father is totally on our side. The basic attitude that is suitable for the God of the Christians is invincible trust, unlimited trust. As St. Therese of Lisieux, the most recent doctor of the Church, that means the Church has set its stamp of approval on her teaching, she says, you can never have too much confidence in God, who is so good and so merciful. And she says elsewhere, if I had on my conscience every conceivable crime, I would lose nothing of my confidence. But with my heart breaking with sorrow, I would throw myself into the arms of God without hesitation, and I know that I would be well received.